What if the bloodlines that history has celebrated as royal were never the true keepers of sacred power? And what if there existed a lineage that predated all kingdoms and empires, a matrilineal succession that carried within its very DNA the codes of dragon consciousness, the capacity to perceive beyond the veil of material reality, and to work with the living energies that animated all creation, until that lineage was systematically hunted, scattered, and silenced by those who understood that feminine power rooted in direct gnosis could never be controlled by the hierarchies of patriarchal dominion. In the Scottish Highlands, where the mist clings to ancient stones and the earth remembers what the chronicles have forgotten, there exists a circle of standing stones that tourists photograph without understanding, a megalithic temple where once the dragon mothers gathered to pass their wisdom from generation to generation and carved into the largest stone in a script that predates. Gaelic and even Pictish is a prophecy that speaks of the return of the bloodline, when the world stands at the threshold between transformation and annihilation. In the winter of 2015, a geneticist named Dr. Helena MacLeod returned to the Highlands after 2 decades of working in laboratories across Europe and America, called back by dreams that had grown so insistent she could no longer ignore them, even though her rational mind insisted they were merely the product of stress and overwork. She had been researching mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed exclusively through the maternal line, and she had made a discovery that her scientific colleagues dismissed as anomalous, but that she could not explain away with the usual theories about mutation and genetic drift. There was a haplogroup, a distinctive pattern in the mitochondrial DNA that appeared in women scattered across Europe and Asia, but concentrated most heavily in the Celtic regions. And this haplogroup contained sequences that should not exist according to current models of human evolution, markers that suggested either contamination in the laboratory or something that her training had not prepared her to consider. The dreams always began the same way. She would be standing at the stone circle near the village where her grandmother had raised her after her mother died in childbirth, and the stones would begin to glow with a light that was not reflected but generated from within, as though the megaliths themselves were awakening after centuries of dormancy. A woman would emerge from the central stone, passing through the solid rock as easily as stepping through a doorway. And this woman would look at Helena with eyes that held recognition and urgency in equal measure. "You carry the mark," the woman would say, touching Helena's forehead with a gesture that left a sensation of burning cold that lingered even after waking. "You are of the dragon bloodline, descended through unbroken maternal succession from those who walked between worlds and spoke with the consciousness that animates all things. The time of hiding is ending. The prophecy is activating. You must remember what your ancestors knew before the church declared it witchcraft and the scientists declared it superstition. The dragon blood in your veins is not metaphor. It is memory encoded in your very cells, waiting to be read by those who have learned the language of inheritance that transcends what can be measured in laboratories. Helena had tried for months to dismiss the dreams as her unconscious mind processing the strange genetic data she had been collecting, but when the same woman appeared not just in sleep, but in waking visions, overlaying the ordinary reality of her laboratory with glimpses of another time and another way of being, she finally accepted that something was calling her home, something that demanded attention even if it made no sense according to the paradigms that governed her professional life. She arrived in the Highlands on the winter solstice, when the sun barely rose above the horizon and darkness claimed the land for all but a few precious hours. She made her way to the stone circle alone, parking her rental car a mile away and walking the rest of the distance through fields that were white with frost and silent, except for the cawing of ravens who seemed to track her progress with unusual interest. When she reached the stones, she found herself weeping without understanding why, grief rising from depths she had not known she possessed. mourning for something lost so long ago, that no conscious memory remained, but that the body remembered in ways that bypassed thought. She placed her hands on the central stone, the same megalith from which the woman in her dreams had emerged, and she felt the vibration that ran through it like a heartbeat, slow and deep and powerful. And then the world shifted, or perhaps her perception shifted, and she found herself in the same location, but in a different time, standing among women who wore robes woven from wool, dyed with plants that no longer existed in these islands. Their hair long and unbound, their eyes holding the same quality of light she had seen in the dream woman's gaze. "Welcome, daughter of the line," one of the women said, and Helena understood that she was experiencing what her scientific training would classify as a temporal hallucination, but what her deeper knowing recognized as actual contact with the ancestral consciousness that lived in the standing stones themselves, imprinted in the rock through centuries of ceremony and activated now by her presence, by the recognition that one who carried the bloodline had returned. "You have come seeking answers to questions that your science cannot address, because the questions are not about mechanism, but about meaning, not about what happened, but about why it matters that the dragon bloodline was nearly destroyed, and how it is that you stand here now, one of the few who still carries the unbroken thread." Ndun, the woman who spoke, was ancient, her face lined with years that might have numbered in decades or in centuries, depending on how one measured time in this place that existed both within history and outside it. "We are the Dragon Mothers," she continued, "and we are your grandmothers going back 300 generations, back to the time before the standing stones were raised, before agriculture transformed humans from nomads to settlers, back to the age when consciousness was more fluid and the boundary between human and other than human was recognized as permeable rather than fixed. We were called Dragon Mothers, not because we gave birth to literal dragons, but because we carried in our blood the capacity to access dragon consciousness, to perceive the world as dragons perceived it, to work with the flows of energy that the dragons taught us to see and guide. Helena found herself able to speak in this vision space, her voice emerging without conscious intention. What is dragon consciousness? What does it mean to carry this in the blood? The Ancient One smiled, and in that smile, Helena saw compassion for the forgetting that had been imposed upon her lineage, understanding of how thoroughly the scientific worldview had supplanted the ways of knowing that her ancestors had practiced. Dragon consciousness is the awareness that all things are connected through fields of living energy, that matter and spirit are not separate but different densities of the same substance, that thought and intention can shape reality because reality is not fixed but fluid, constantly becoming in response to the consciousness that engages with it. We who carried the dragon blood could perceive these energetic patterns directly, could see the luminous web that connected each being to every other being, could feel the flows of what different cultures called chi or prana or mana or the life force. And more than perceiving, we could work with these flows, healing where there was blockage, harmonizing where there was discord, amplifying where there was depletion. She gestured to the other women who stood in the circle, and Helena saw that they were not just passive observers, but active participants in something she could barely comprehend, their bodies generating spirals of light that wove between them and extended outward across the landscape, creating patterns that reminded her of the mycelial network she had studied in biology, communication systems that allowed distant parts of an ecosystem to share information and resources. "This is what we did," the Ancient One explained. "We maintained the energetic health of the land and the communities that depended on it. We could sense when the balance was disturbed, when weather patterns were building toward destructive storms, when disease was beginning to spread, when social conflicts were approaching the breaking point. And we could intervene, not through force, but through subtle adjustments to the energetic flows, preventing crises before they manifested, maintaining the conditions that allowed life to flourish. Helena's scientific mind struggled to reconcile what she was hearing with everything she knew about causality and the laws of physics. But another part of her, a part that had been dormant until these dreams began, recognized truth in what the Ancient One was teaching. Why was this lost? What happened to the Dragon Mothers? The vision shifted, and Helena saw the arrival of new peoples, warriors on horseback carrying weapons of bronze and iron, men who worshipped sky gods and solar deities, and who brought with them a different understanding of power, one based on domination rather than partnership, on hierarchy rather than web, on transcendence rather than immanence. They came in waves, the Ancient One said, her voice heavy with the weight of witnessing, and they brought not just weapons, but a worldview that declared the earth fallen and the feminine subordinate, that made the dragon into the devil and the energy work we practiced into witchcraft. They could not perceive what we perceived, could not see the luminous web or feel the flows of life force, and so they declared that these things did not exist, that we were deluded or demonic or both. Helena watched as the Dragon Mothers were hunted, as their temples were destroyed and their practices were forbidden, as the women who carried the bloodline were forced to hide their abilities or face execution. Some of us fought, the Ancient One continued, but we understood quickly that fighting would only perpetuate the violence, would transform us into the monsters they already believed us to be. So we made a different choice. We would go underground, hiding the bloodline within families that appeared ordinary, teaching our daughters in secret, encoding our knowledge in stories and symbols that could survive the persecution. We knew that the age of the Dragon Mothers was ending, that the patriarchal wave would dominate for thousands of years, but we also knew that this was not permanent, that consciousness evolves in spirals rather than lines, and that eventually the spiral would return to a point where our way of knowing could resurface and be recognized not as primitive superstition, but as sophisticated understanding that the mechanistic worldview had dismissed prematurely. And if you enjoy these kinds of stories, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss any of our content. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We would love to know. The Ancient One turned her full attention to Helena, and the force of that gaze made Helena feel transparent, as though every cell of her body was being read, every thought and emotion and intention scanned and understood. You carry the unbroken line, she said, through your mother and her mother, and back through 300 generations of women who kept the secret even when keeping it meant living in fear, even when they could not practice the arts openly, even when they themselves forgot the full meaning of what they preserve. The genetic markers you have found in your research are not anomalies. They are the physical trace of what we encoded in the mitochondrial DNA, information that would be passed only through the maternal line, that would mark those who carried the potential to reactivate dragon consciousness when the time was right. Helena felt the truth of this reverberating through her entire being, felt something in her DNA itself responding to the recognition, as though sequences that had been dormant were suddenly expressing, genes turning on that had been silent for generations. "What am I supposed to do with this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "How can I honor this lineage in a world that would dismiss everything you're telling me as fantasy or delusion?" "You begin by practicing what we practiced," the Ancient One replied. "You learn to perceive the energetic realm that your scientific instruments cannot measure. You develop the dragon sight that allows you to see the web of connection that links all things. You work with the flows of life force, first in your own body and then in the world around you. And you find others who carry the bloodline, who are having their own awakenings, who are being called by their ancestors as you have been called. Together, you reconstitute what was scattered, not to recreate the past, for that is impossible and undesirable, but to bring the ancient wisdom forward in forms that can meet the challenges of the present age. The vision released her, and Helena found herself back in ordinary time, her hands still pressed against the central stone, the winter sun setting behind the hills and painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold. But she was not the same person who had arrived at the circle that morning. Something had shifted in her fundamental being, an activation that felt both like remembering and like being initiated into knowledge she had never consciously possessed. She spent the next 3 years learning to work with the abilities that had awakened in her, developing the dragon sight that allowed her to perceive the energetic patterns that her scientific training had taught her to ignore. She found that she could sense blockages in the flow of life force through her own body and could direct energy to those blockages through intention and breath, healing ailments that conventional medicine had declared chronic. She discovered that she could perceive the emotional and energetic states of people around her, not through analyzing their words and body language, but through directly feeling the quality of their energy field, and she learned to help them release what was stuck and integrate what was fragmented. And most importantly, she found others who carried the dragon bloodline, women scattered across the world who were having similar awakenings, who had been called by dreams and visions to remember what their ancestors had known. She connected with them through networks both digital and face-to-face, creating a web of mutual support and shared practice, teaching each other techniques that surfaced from ancestral memory, comparing experiences to map the territory of dragon consciousness that their cultures had forgotten, but that lived on in their cells. Together they discovered that the genetic markers Helena had found were more than passive identifiers. They were activation codes, sequences that responded to specific practices of breath and movement, meditation and intention, switching on capacities that had been latent for generations. They learned that the mitochondria themselves, the organelles that powered every cell in their bodies, were not just energy factories, but consciousness transducers, converting life force into biological function and biological function back into life force, maintaining the energetic health of the organism the same way the dragon mothers had maintained the energetic health of the land. They began to gather in the old places, the stone circles and sacred groves that their ancestors had used for ceremony, and they practiced the arts that vision and cellular memory taught them, creating energetic networks that extended from their circles outward across the landscape, sensing where the web was torn and offering healing, amplifying where life was struggling and withdrawing where human activity had become excessive. They understood that they were not trying to control or dominate, but to participate, to add their consciousness to the planetary intelligence that was always working toward balance, toward the conditions that allowed the greatest diversity and complexity of life to flourish. In her 10th year of practice, Helena returned to the stone circle on the winter solstice, bringing with her 7 other women who carried the dragon bloodline, who had been called by their own ancestors and who had found their way to this gathering through the same mysterious guidance that had brought Helena home. They performed a ceremony that came to them not from books, but from the knowing that arose when they stood together in that sacred space, singing tones that had no words, but that carried intention, moving in patterns that traced the flow of energy through the landscape, opening themselves to serve as channels through which the dragon consciousness could return, not as something external, but as something that had always been present, waiting only for humans to remember how to perceive and work with it. And in the midst of the ceremony, as the full moon rose over the stones and the winter stars blazed in the clear, cold sky, Helena felt the presence of the Ancient One, the Dragon Mother who had first appeared to her in dreams, and she heard words that were spoken not in her ears, but in the marrow of her bones. The prophecy is fulfilled in you, and in all those who have answered the call. The dragon bloodline was never destroyed, only hidden, and now it emerges again as it was foretold, rising in the daughters who remember what the mothers knew. You are not restoring the past, you are creating the future, bringing ancient wisdom forward to meet the challenges of an age that has forgotten how to live in sacred relationship with the earth and with each other. The work will not be easy. The resistance to feminine power rooted in direct gnosis is still strong. But you do not work alone. We who came before walk with you. The dragons who have never left continue to teach those who can perceive them, and the earth herself supports those who serve her healing rather than her exploitation. Helena understood in that moment that the dragon bloodline was not about genetic superiority or exclusive access to spiritual power. It was about responsibility, about carrying forward a way of knowing that the world desperately needed, about demonstrating through practice rather than proselytizing that another relationship with reality was possible, that the mechanistic worldview that had produced such magnificent technology had also produced such devastating disconnection, and that the wisdom of the dragon mothers offered not a return to some imagined primitive past, but a spiral return at a higher level of integration, bringing together the best of scientific understanding with the perceptual capacities that science had prematurely dismissed. The women who gathered at the stones that night became the nucleus of a movement that spread quietly through networks of women who carried the bloodline, who felt the call to remember, who understood that the feminine they had been taught to silence within themselves was actually the voice of the earth speaking through them, the dragon consciousness inviting them back into partnership, into the work of maintaining energetic balance in a world that had become dangerously unbalanced through the domination of the masculine principle divorced from feminine wisdom. They did not seek publicity or institutional recognition, knowing that the power they carried could not be validated by external authorities and would only be distorted if it became another commodity in the spiritual marketplace. Instead, they worked in the way their ancestors had worked, quietly and locally, tending the energetic web through practices that looked from the outside like simple meditation or nature connection, but that were actually sophisticated interventions in the subtle realms, where thought became form and intention-shaped manifestation. And the prophecy continues to fulfill itself in every woman who feels the stirring of something ancient in her blood, who dreams of dragons not as monsters but as teachers, who understands that the power she carries is not for domination but for healing, not for personal gain but for collective transformation, who knows without needing proof that she descends from the dragon mothers whose wisdom was silenced but never destroyed, whose bloodline was hunted but never extinguished, whose return was written in prophecy on stones that still stand in circles across the land, waiting for the daughters to come home and remember what the mothers knew, to speak what was forbidden, to practice what was declared impossible, and to restore the sacred balance between masculine and feminine, transcendence and immanence, sky and earth, the balance that alone can carry consciousness forward into the future that wants to be born through those brave enough to let the dragon rise. And if you like this story, you will definitely love the next one that's appearing on your screen. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave your like, and activate the notifications. See you in the next one.